Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when the Victorians had exactly zero idea how to entertain themselves, except for, dying of tuberculosis, complaining about the weather, and inventing some of the most bizarre hobbies you can imagine. No Netflix, no TikTok, just pure, unfiltered chaos in the form of parlor games, dance marathons, and a circus that would make today's circus performers run for the hills. But before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. And leave a comment telling me your favorite Victorian pastime. Was it fending off rats, or maybe attending a death-defying public execution? Now dim those lights, turn on a fan if you need a little ambient breeze. Get cozy, and for the love of all things good, make sure your feet are tucked in. Because, you see, Victorian floors were a hazard in more ways than one. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in a time when your idea of a fun night was staring at your own reflection in a mirror that may or may not have been cursed? Or maybe you've wondered just how long you could last in a game of croquet with no one actually keeping track of the rules, if you even had the energy for that. Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in Victorian England. The year is 1851. It's foggy, your boots are wet, and everything smells like coal. Good luck. Let's start with a game of guess how long you can tolerate your relatives' voices without pretending to pass out from a mysterious ailment. Parlor games were the lifeblood of Victorian social life. Sure, they didn't have PS5s, but they did have charades, card games that made Monopoly look like an Olympic sport, and games that had no actual point at all. Imagine hours of standing around, pretending to enjoy yourself, while everyone else dramatically rolls their eyes and secretly wonders if it's time to go home. But let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be trapped in a room with a bunch of people who are way too enthusiastic about a game that involves no real skills, just complete and utter chaos? Picture this. It's the 1860s. Your aunt is dressed in an impossible amount of lace, and your uncle is still recovering from his jolly morning brandy. The game, penny ante. The rules? Nobody knows, but that doesn't stop them from playing for hours. And instead of stopping when it's all too much, everyone's been trained by Victorian etiquette to smile and nod, like they enjoy the game, and the game is enjoyable. It's like that feeling when someone suggests, let's do a team building exercise at work, only it's mandatory. Then, there's the classic of classics, charades. If you've never experienced it, imagine trying to guess a movie title from a 10-second performance with absolutely no context and only wildly gesturing hand movements. Now throw in a Victorian twist. No easy movie titles. So this is more like depict the Battle of Waterloo using only interpretive dance and an imaginary hat. It's like trying to guess a riddle when the only clue is an aggressively flailing elbow and an occasional head tilt. And let's be real, every game of charades ends the same way. Someone, probably your very earnest cousin, decides to dramatically pantomime the entire plot of Moby Dick. But you've just realized that you've been in this drawing room for so long, you can't remember if you've eaten today. So instead of caring, you slowly start to wonder if you can fake a headache long enough to escape. But it wasn't just charades that ruled these social gatherings. Oh no. There were also games like forfeits, where you'd have to do something ridiculous in exchange for a prize, like recite Shakespeare while hopping on one foot, or worse, act out an emotional monologue about an imaginary cow. Because who doesn't want to watch their 50-year-old uncle pretend to be a cow while everyone's awkwardly cheering him on? Yes, this was Victorian entertainment at its finest, folks. Confusion, overenthusiasm, and bafflingly poor choices. And lest you think the Victorians were the epitome of decorum, let's not forget the game The Minister's Cat. It's basically a long line of people, each coming up with an adjective that starts with each letter of the alphabet, describing the minister's cat. So you might hear something like, "The minister's cat is adorable," followed by, "The minister's cat is benevolent," then "The minister's cat is charming." But don't you dare take the easy route and say caring or cheerful. No, no. The whole game becomes an unspoken contest about who can come up with the most absurd adjective that nobody has ever used to describe a cat before. You'd end up hearing things like, "The minister's cat is cryptographically coded." Sure, why not? After all, it's just an innocent game designed to keep you awake while everyone else desperately clings to their polite facades. At the heart of all these games was an intense desire for social validation and also a deep fear of breaking any social convention. It was a time where if you failed to pretend to enjoy yourself during a round of blind man's bluff, a game in which someone is blindfolded and spun around while the rest of you scatter around the room like hyperactive chickens, you could find yourself at the edge of social extinction. And yet, there was no avoiding it. The games were everywhere, as relentless as the fog in London's streets, enveloping you no matter where you went. If you tried to retreat to the corner, someone would inevitably grab you and drag you back into the fold with the enthusiastic cry of, "You've got to play. Everyone's playing." What else could you do? You'd just sigh, brush off the dust from your overly starched corset, and pretend you were thrilled to be there, one eyebrow permanently raised in confusion. And of course, let's not forget the ever-popular card games. Not the poker you might be thinking of, but instead games with names like Whist or Whistle Dom. These games were more complicated than deciphering the plot of The Matrix after a long night of brandy. If you ever had the pleasure of sitting down with your great-aunt to play, you quickly realized that this wasn't about fun, it was about survival. In fact, there's a good chance you'd spend the majority of the game quietly wondering how many centuries it would take to master these unreasonably convoluted rules. And by the time you had that figured out, you'd probably need another cup of tea and a long nap to recover. So yes, while we may look back on these games and laugh, one thing is clear. The Victorians sure knew how to kill time. They didn't need Netflix, Instagram, or even a proper understanding of the rules. They had each other, their weirdly complex games, and an endless supply of hope that just maybe they'd make it through the night without pretending to faint. Ah, tea. If there's one thing the Victorians knew, it was how to make something as simple as boiling water into a whole event. Afternoon tea wasn't just a casual sip, it was a display of upper-class sophistication. Picture this, a table filled with cakes, sandwiches, and enough chin-wagging to make you question your entire existence. And the best part? It was more about what you were wearing while you sat than actually drinking the tea. It was like the precursor to brunch, but with a lot more sugar and a little less honesty about how much you wanted to be there. Now, I know what you're thinking. Tea sounds lovely, but I can barely manage a 15-minute Zoom call, let alone an entire afternoon pretending to care about the intricate origins of the Earl Grey I'm drinking. But trust me, this wasn't just about tea. This was about status. It was about saying, "Look at me. I have time to sit down for 2 hours and pretend that gossiping about the weather is an important cultural activity. This wasn't your average cup of tea, my friend. This was the ceremonial version. They would bring out delicate china cups, often with actual gold rims, because apparently tea tastes better when it's perched on something that's barely functional. Each sip, more dignified than the last, was a testament to your ability to sip and nod in agreement while silently counting the minutes until you could escape without offending anyone. But let's be honest, what you were really doing during these tea gatherings was attempting to balance the fine art of looking busy and pretending to listen. It was the Victorian version of multitasking. You'd look at the delicate pastries, somehow arranged in a way that makes you question why someone would put so much effort into something that will be consumed in 2 bites, and pretend that you were interested in whether Mrs. Hargrove's second cousin's dog had been ill last week. Of course, you weren't interested. You were too busy contemplating whether the cucumber sandwich was worth the risk of getting crumbs on your favorite embroidered napkin. And besides, someone had to maintain the image of being an absolute expert on how to casually sip from your cup while delicately balancing it on the edge of a saucer that was about as functional as a piece of art in a museum. The Victorian upper class also made an art out of how they sat during these tea gatherings. Have you ever tried to hold an awkward posture for an extended period of time, all the while trying not to seem like you were actually contorting your spine to get the correct T-pose? That's basically what they did. Your posture had to be impeccable, which meant that you could forget about slouching or getting comfy. You needed to sit up straight, chin up, like someone who had mastered the art of sitting still, while knowing deep down you were just waiting for your tea to cool off so you could stop pretending to sip in an air of exaggerated politeness. It wasn't even about the tea itself. The actual beverage often took a backseat to the social performance. If you weren't exchanging polite comments about someone else's choice of tea, you were being asked about your most recent shopping escapades, by which they meant the casual 4-hour walk you took to pick up a handkerchief that had to be embroidered just so. You didn't even have to have a deep connection with these people. It was all about maintaining your place in society's oh-so-delicate social fabric. And you could only really do that by proving that you could survive this kind of event without breaking down into a sweaty heap on the floor. But let's not forget the food. Ah yes, the finger sandwiches, the cakes, and those biscuits that were probably invented solely to give you an excuse to actually eat something while pretending not to be starving. The cucumber sandwiches were so thin you could barely detect that there was anything resembling food inside them. And don't even get me started on the cakes. A single bite of a Victorian cake might send you into a sugar coma, but no one would dare show anything less than absolute delight. Your entire afternoon was now about enjoying the fact that you might have just consumed the equivalent of a sugar-loaded pillow without anyone realizing how much of it you actually ate. Oh yes, you'd say. This cake really brings out the notes of jam and questionable icing. And no one would question your words because they too had been brainwashed into a world of polite, ceremonial food consumption. By the time the event came to a close, you were expected to leave with the illusion that you had engaged in meaningful conversation and sophisticated tea drinking. You'd smile and shuffle out, your corset now uncomfortably tight, your mouth coated in the remnants of your refreshing cup of tea. But let's be honest, you didn't really care about the tea or the pastries. You just survived a 2-hour performance, And now, you could go back to your normal life, knowing full well that you would never be able to unknow how many times you said, "Isn't it just lovely?" without even realizing it. Afternoon tea wasn't just about drinking tea, it was a social battle, a performance, and if you played it right, a chance to show off just how well you could pretend to enjoy yourself. And hey, maybe it's not so different from modern day brunch, except with more layers of heavy lace and significantly less sincerity. Forget about the circus you know today with its popcorn and elephants. Victorian circuses were like a Netflix horror show mixed with a drama class. You could watch someone juggle flaming clubs or ride a horse while balancing on a unicycle. And who could forget the acrobats? They were doing flips that would make modern gymnasts dizzy and probably a bit worried for their lives. The only difference between a Victorian circus and a modern one was the constant threat of someone dying mid-act. A real high-stakes situation, if you ask me. Imagine the scene. You're sitting in a makeshift wooden arena, the air thick with the smell of sweat, sawdust, and an alarming number of unwashed bodies. There are no air-conditioned tents or cushy seats, just a bunch of people crammed into wooden benches, one clutching their tickets like they've just signed up for an actual death match. The circus performers are gods and daredevils, all rolled into one. There's a ringmaster, probably wearing an unnecessarily large hat, and a coat that's so bright it could cause sunburns at 20 paces. The man commands attention, not just with his booming voice, but with the constant aura of danger hovering over everything he says. Take the acrobats, for instance. They weren't your garden variety, overly sanitized gymnasts in glittering costumes. No, no. These were people flinging themselves into the air, often wearing nothing but suspenders and sheer willpower. Their tricks involved such a high risk of serious injury that it's a miracle that no one came away from the circus permanently reclassified as a part-time human pancake. Think about it. These performers would fling themselves into the air, spinning like rag dolls, with no net to catch them, because apparently netting wasn't part of the budget. Can you imagine sitting in the audience, biting your nails as someone does a flip, only to realize that the next person in line might be you if they miss? Oh dear, is that your jaw on the floor, sir? I believe it's now part of the act. And then there were the death-defying stunts. Picture this, someone on a horse, riding around a ring while balancing on a unicycle. No big deal, right? Wrong. This wasn't some controlled trick you'd see in today's circus, where everything's more regulated than the stock market. This was pure chaos. The unicycle was a terrifying contraption that might as well have been a giant wooden wheel with zero safety features. If you took a spill, you weren't just getting a bruise. You were probably becoming part of the act in a much less glamorous way. But wait, it doesn't stop there. For every one of these audacious stunts, there was always a sense of impending doom. Picture the human cannonball, a person stuffed into a large cannon and fired across the tent, only to land on a pile of hay, hopefully. The audience would gasp and clutch their hearts, unsure whether they should be concerned or just impressed by how casually the performer had been loaded into what could only be described as the world's worst game of human darts. The performance ended with an enthusiastic bang, followed by what could best be described as a collective exhale from the crowd as the human cannonball landed, more or less intact. But behind the scenes, well, the performers were praying they'd just survived, let alone make it through the next show. And while you might think the ringmaster was there to manage all this chaos, he was also part of the problem. Imagine a guy who lives for the thrill of the circus, big mustache, dramatic posture, cape flying in the wind, yelling, "Step right up, see the woman who is about to jump through a ring of fire. Nothing can go wrong." Of course, he says this with the kind of self-assurance that only comes from not being the one in the fire ring. He'd stare down at the audience, arms wide, beckoning them to witness feats of strength, skill, and let's be real, sheer idiocy. Each act was presented as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Oh, don't mind her," the ringmaster would say, as a woman swung from trapeze bars to "She's been practicing since childhood, probably." There was an almost cult-like enthusiasm for convincing the crowd that nothing could possibly go wrong. And while that may have been mostly true, the truth was that a lot of things could, in fact, go wrong. Let's not forget the clowns. Now, Victorian clowns weren't the happy balloon animal making, face paint wearing versions we know today. These clowns were dark. Imagine someone with an oversized top hat, a face painted in a terrifying shade of white, and clothes that made you question their sanity, or at least the sanity of whoever decided to hire them. They didn't make balloon animals. They made you question your life choices, and not in a fun way. In fact, Victorian clowns often had a strange knack for blending comedy with sheer terror. The audience didn't just laugh nervously, they also backed away slowly, just in case the clown decided to juggle knives, or worse, fire. In the end, the circus was an unpredictable mess of danger and spectacle, with just enough charm to make you forget the part where someone could end up seriously injured. It was part entertainment, part survival challenge. But here's the kicker. Despite the chaos, despite the threat of spontaneous injury, the Victorians loved it. There was something exhilarating about watching these brave souls do things that would make modern performers break out in a cold sweat. Sure, you might leave with more than one gray hair, but you'd never forget the time you saw a man juggling flaming clubs while riding a unicycle and somehow didn't catch on fire. It was like watching a reality show, only instead of voting people off, you were just hoping they didn't get voted into the hospital. High stakes indeed. In Victorian England, the music hall was where the magic happened, or at least where the stage magic happened. Think less ballet and more, let's hire some questionable people for a night of mildly offensive comedy. The performers had one mission, to distract you from the fact that you probably hadn't had a decent bath in weeks. And oh, how they succeeded. From hilarious songs about questionable life choices to performers who might have been just a little too enthusiastic for their own good, this was live entertainment in its rawest form. Now let's imagine you've stepped through the doors of a Victorian music hall. It's dark, it's noisy, and it smells faintly of sweat, tobacco, and whatever scent was fashionable for the evening, probably something called Eau de Dickensian grime. The floorboards creak as the audience settles into their cramped, possibly damp seats, all hoping to forget that they've been enduring a week of questionable hygiene practices and just one too many near-miss encounters with rats. The lights flicker on the stage, revealing a dimly lit, slightly crooked set where the night's entertainment will unfold. But forget about fancy chandeliers and velvet curtains. This is the era of raw, unrefined theater where no one pretends to be fancy. If the show doesn't make you laugh, it might at least give you a little second-hand embarrassment. Enter the performers, who make today's reality stars look tame by comparison. These were the kind of people who wouldn't just perform, They became their characters. They were loud, they were brash, and they weren't afraid to make you uncomfortable for the sake of humor. You might get a raucous song about the misadventures of a man who accidentally wandered into a fancy dinner party, sat at the wrong table, and somehow became the life of the event by just not understanding basic social etiquette. The lyrics would be as absurd as they were catchy, and the crowd would laugh, nervously at first, then louder as they realized they'd been taken on a bizarre yet oddly relatable journey. It's the Victorian version of, "Oops, I didn't mean to offend, but here I am anyway." There were also performers who were way too invested in their roles to take the overly enthusiastic comedian who would practically shout their jokes to the back of the room, desperately trying to coax a laugh from an audience that was half inclined to start a whisper campaign about the food they'd eaten for lunch. These comedians weren't interested in subtle wits or timing. No, they relied on extreme enthusiasm, the kind of energy that left you wondering if they were secretly getting paid to wear out their vocal cords. Imagine someone shouting, and I tell you, if I'm lying, I'm on fire, while waving their arms like they were trying to signal a ship in a fog. You'd laugh out of sheer survival instinct. But it wasn't all loud, boisterous humor. Victorian music halls also had their share of melancholy numbers. Some performances involved songs so tragic, you'd leave questioning everything about your life, and wondering why the woman singing about her lost love was somehow both extraordinarily talented and emotionally manipulative. There's nothing quite like hearing a ballad about the poor working class and their crushing misfortunes, then immediately following it up with a comedian who thinks the best way to cheer you up is by dressing like a penguin and slipping on a banana peel. It's a roller coaster of emotions that left you simultaneously depressed and confused, perfect for someone who had just spent the last few hours avoiding conversation with their neighbor who definitely smelled like they didn't own a washcloth. But no matter what part of the show you found yourself caught up in, one thing was certain: Victorian music halls knew how to distract you. If you were lucky, you'd forget, if only for an hour or two, that your clothes were 2 sizes too tight, your hair had seen better days, and your personal hygiene routine was probably more of a suggestion than a habit. After all, you couldn't very well focus on your issues when you were being serenaded by a man in an oversized bowler hat, singing about the very real threat of losing your shirt in a betting game. There were no airs and graces here. This was gritty, raw entertainment. It was fun, it was fast, and occasionally it was a little bit absurd. Of course, the real joy came from not knowing what would happen next. The unpredictability of the evening kept the audience at the edge of their seats, waiting to see if someone would spontaneously trip over a prop, if the band would accidentally fall out of sync, or if a performer would go rogue and just start singing a completely out of context tune. And nothing quite captured the heart of Victorian comedy like the inevitable awkward moment when the performer failed to land their punchline, or worse, when they completely forgot the punchline and had to improvise. The audience would laugh, not because the joke was funny, but because they could sense the desperation behind the performer's eyes as they tried to salvage a dying act. By the end of the night, as you shuffled out of the hall with a sore stomach from laughter, and possibly from the overly buttery snack you tried to ignore, you'd realize that despite the occasional awkwardness and the off-key singing, the Victorian music hall had done its job. It had distracted you, entertained you, and reminded you that no matter how tough life got, there was always a place for a ridiculous song or a loud, overly dramatic joke about misplacing your hat at a party. Because in the end, the Victorian music hall wasn't just about entertainment. It was about surviving the madness of the world with a little laughter, no matter how strange or offensive it might be. Let's talk about photography. Now, don't imagine a cute selfie or even a flattering portrait. No, no, no. Victorians had the idea of photography, but it was basically a game of how uncomfortable can we make you while capturing your soul, or maybe just your half-conscious face. You'd have to sit still for up to 10 minutes for a single photo, probably trying to resist the urge to blink or cough. The result? A photo that was either terrifying, stiff, or a little too much like the daguerreotype version of a mugshot. Now picture this. You've just been ushered into a dark, poorly ventilated room that smells faintly of chemicals and mildew. You're told to sit still on a hard wooden bench, and the photographer, who is almost certainly wearing a waistcoat that's too tight, has just instructed you to not move. For the next 10 minutes, you're expected to maintain the same expression as if you were being asked to attend a particularly boring church service. And of course, it's the most important photo of your life. You know this because this photo will be one of the only lasting impressions of you in the world. And no, you're not allowed to blink. That's a no-go. So there you are, sitting perfectly still, attempting to smile in the most restrained way possible. But let's face it, your smile looks more like someone asked you to hold in a sneeze. But that's not all. The photographer's camera is a behemoth of a machine. It's not the sleek, modern marvel that snaps photos at the speed of light. No, this camera looks like it was designed by someone who had never heard of the word compact. It's heavy, cumbersome, and it's pointed right at your face, like a giant, intimidating camera eye that's about to judge you for every single inch of your appearance. The photographer, standing behind it with an air of grim determination, might give you some kind of last-minute advice. Hold still, or do not move your head. But the result is always the same. You sit there, unsure if you should smile or simply remain as expressionless as possible. Whatever you choose, it's guaranteed to look unnatural. And heaven forbid you move a muscle. That's when you're at risk of ruining the entire shot and having to repeat the process all over again. And let's not even get started on how terrifying those photos must have looked when you finally saw the result. The exposure times were long, which meant that no one could afford to look like they were having fun in their photos. If you were lucky, the photographer would give you a stern look and tell you that you could relax, but chances are that would only result in an image of you with a look of pure panic etched across your face. A single blink would ruin everything, and let's face it, nobody was good at keeping their eyes wide open for 10 minutes without a little bit of twitching. This is where those famously stiff, unsettling expressions come from. Imagine staring at the camera for long enough that your eyelids start to betray you, but you still have to keep the do not blink face while internally begging for the pain to stop. The photographer, of course, will insist on multiple shots. No, just one wasn't enough. And even if you tried to get comfortable, the poses were far from natural. Who needs comfortable posture when you could have an upright, a rigid back that might actually break by the end of the shoot? At least there was a bit of fun for the photographer, who had, by this time, probably perfected the art of making people look like they had been frozen in time, not just posed for a photo. They were masters of lighting, or perhaps it's more accurate to say, masters of shadowing, because nothing quite says, "I'm here for a fun portrait," like a dark, ominous shadow cast across half of your face. The result wasn't just a snapshot of someone's features, it was a terrifying representation of what you would look like if someone told you that you were going to be staring at a wall for the next 12 hours, forced to remain absolutely still. You might as well have been frozen in amber. Let's not forget the hair. If you were a Victorian woman, your hair was probably styled with more pins than a pin cushion, and every strand had to be perfect. The idea was to look like a porcelain doll, or at least like someone who had never gotten a bad hair day in their entire life. It took hours to perfect, and then you had to sit for an eternity in front of a camera, hoping you didn't accidentally mess it up. And men? Well, they had the luxury of stiff collars and waistcoats that required near military precision to keep everything looking sharp. But the stiff poses meant that just like everyone else, they were stuck looking as though they had just attended the world's most uncomfortable family reunion. And what was the reward for all this suffering? Well, if you were lucky, you'd get a daguerreotype, a shiny metal plate with your image immortalized forever. You'd stare at it for years, in wondering if that moment of grin and bear it was truly the best you could muster. But there was no escaping the truth. Your awkward, stiff, unblinking portrait would be passed down for generations, reminding everyone who saw it that you too had once stared into the soul of a giant camera and lived to tell the tale, sort of. So the next time you're snapping selfies or capturing moments with a simple click, take a moment to appreciate how easy you have it. Because in the Victorian era, if you wanted a photo, you had to sit still long enough to regret every life choice that led you to this moment. And that's before you even saw the result. Before Twitter, there were newspapers, and in Victorian times, they were the go-to for all things gossip, scandal, and public shaming. The Victorians loved their news, like we love spoilers for the latest streaming show. It wasn't just the politicians who got roasted in print. It was the average Joe who accidentally spilled his tea on the Queen's carriage or mispronounced scone at the wrong dinner party. Every day, there was a new outrage, and the best part? You could read all about it over your morning cup of tea. Now picture this. It's 1850, and you're sitting down to a nice breakfast of bread, butter, and some tea. Probably not as good as the one you'll get at a high-end cafe today, but it'll do. As you sip your slightly too hot beverage, you unfold the day's newspaper, an absolute monster of a publication, thick enough to use as a doorstop. And there it is, on the front page. Local merchant Bumble's scone pronunciation causes social disaster. Yes, it's not a headline about some international calamity, a massive political scandal, or even a truly terrible storm. It's about how one man in a single flustered moment at a dinner party managed to pronounce the word scone wrong. The entire room went silent. It was an offense so egregious that it became front page material. And if you thought the local gossip mill would be satisfied with that, think again. The whole story gets spun further with quotes from the people who witnessed the disaster, each one more dramatic than the last. He might as well have shouted scone while wearing a chicken suit. One bystander is quoted so much for his social reputation. The Victorians could roast you in print for a single awkward moment, and they loved doing it. But it wasn't just the unintentional slip-ups of the average man. Oh no, no. The Victorians were just as obsessed with their politicians as we are with reality TV stars today. You think we have scandalous headlines now? Victorian newspapers would destroy reputations with just a few words. A corrupt politician could be exposed for his misdeeds, and with the public's love for a good scandal, would probably find himself fired, but not before his failure was retold in every possible detail. If you had an affair, don't worry, your dirty laundry will be aired in front of everyone. If you wore an ill-fitting coat to Parliament, it was probably the punchline of a political cartoon. The best part? You couldn't escape. There were no cancel buttons or hide from timeline features back then. Your face, your life, and your failures were all right there in the newspaper for everyone to see. Imagine waking up to find that a simple misstep or a poorly timed laugh had cost you your job, reputation, and the public's affection, all thanks to the ink on some poor newspaper editor's fingers. But here's the thing. The Victorians thrived on this kind of daily drama. It was entertainment. Before the days of viral videos, YouTube, and reality TV shows about families who shouldn't be allowed to have pets, newspapers were the only place where you could catch up on everyone's messes, big and small. The local gossip section was like a 19th century soap opera. Every issue had its own set of juicy stories. Sometimes they were about political crises, and other times they were about someone's wild escapades involving stolen chickens or too many brandy cocktails at a wedding reception. And just like today, people couldn't get enough of it. You didn't need to follow someone on Instagram to know everything about their life. All you had to do was open the morning paper, and boom, there it was, in full detail. And let's not forget the advertisements. They were like today's clickbait, but with a twist. For example, imagine you open the paper and see an ad for a revolutionary new soap that cures everything except bad decisions, followed by a glowing testimonial from Mrs. Everly, who swears it cleared up her peculiar skin condition and helped her land a husband who didn't care about her peculiar laugh. Who wouldn't want to buy that soap, right? Just like today, these ads were everywhere, distracting, bizarre, and mildly scandalous. If you weren't reading the salacious headlines or giggling over someone's disastrous evening with the Queen's carriage, you were probably reading ads about cures for things you didn't even know existed, ailments you had no idea could be so creatively named. As you read, you'd occasionally hear a gasp from across the table as your neighbor, too, reads about the latest scandal. Someone's husband has been caught a little too friendly with the parlor maid. It was as though the whole town was in on the secret. And while the affair might not be your business, it's impossible not to gossip. That's how the Victorians liked it. Every page was a new chance to peek behind the curtain and see what everyone else was doing. It wasn't just about facts, it was about the drama. So, if you think the 21st century has perfected the art of gossip and scandal, think again. The Victorians had us beat, and they had a much better excuse to do it: newspapers. The next time you find yourself scrolling through the latest OMG story, just remember, the Victorians would have read it, gossiped about it at the local tea party, and probably even written about it on the front page, because in their world, nothing was too small to make a headline. Imagine this: the Victorian theater. The seats? Harder than your uncle's Christmas fruitcake. The plays? Longer than a Zoom call. The actors? Over the top in a way that makes Shakespeare look like a minimalist. These weren't just plays. They were full-on productions. Elaborate costumes, dramatic lighting, and enough bad wigs to make a hairdresser weep. If you went to the theater, you were not just watching a performance. You were enduring an emotional roller coaster that could end with someone literally dying on stage. And I mean literally dying. Victorian theaters didn't do things by halves. They were about as subtle as a bull in a china shop, and the audience loved it. You'd pay your ticket, climb into a seat that could give you a permanent back injury, and wait for the drama to unfold. The curtains would part, and you'd be hit with a barrage of color, noise, and sometimes smoke, all designed to make you believe you were witnessing the grandest thing in all of history. A person didn't just die on stage. They'd writhe, gasp, and struggle for what felt like hours before dramatically crumpling to the ground in a puddle of fake blood and crushed dreams. And just when you thought the scene was over, there'd be a dramatic monologue about how tragic it all was, leaving the audience in tears, or at least wondering if they were witnessing art or simply a man having a very bad time. But it wasn't just the death scenes that were memorable. No. Every play was packed with enough melodrama to make modern soap operas look like spiritual enlightenment. Actors would speak in booming, but theatrical voices as if they were trying to reach someone at the back of the theater, even if the person they were talking to was sitting right in front of them. Subtlety? That was for the weak. These actors had mastered the art of the grand gesture. If they were angry, they'd stomp across the stage like they were trying to break every floorboard with their foot. If they were sad, they would collapse dramatically on the nearest piece of furniture, possibly spilling an entire glass of wine in the process, just to make sure the audience knew how tragic things were. The dialogue? Oh, the dialogue. Imagine a group of people standing around, talking in circles, making emotional proclamations so bombastic they could have come from a fortune cookie if it had been written by someone with zero sense of brevity. "I will never love again," they would cry. "The betrayal of my heart is more cruel than any blade." You'd be sitting there, trying to keep your eyelids from betraying you by closing, all while the actors went on and on. Of course, you had no choice but to stay alert because, at any moment, someone was likely to scream in your ear, "The truth will come out," and you'd have to endure it, mostly because the alternative was to sneak out during the intermission, if you could even get past the incredibly polite usher who was probably judging you for thinking the play was dragging. And then, of course, there were the costumes. Victorian theater made modern theater look like a casual dress rehearsal. Imagine a corset, petticoats, a cravat, and layers upon layers of velvet and lace, all topped off with a hat that could double as a small shed. When characters would stagger across the stage, their costumes weighing them down, making it look like they were trapped in an elaborate set of curtains they couldn't escape from. You couldn't even see the actors' faces half the time because the wigs were so big. Think of an entire flock of birds perched on their heads. The sheer absurdity of the costumes would sometimes take over the performance, making you forget the plot entirely and just wonder how much it would cost to get a custom wig like that. But hey, if the costumes weren't enough to distract you, the set design would. The Victorian theater loved its sets, big, bulky, and over the top in every possible way. If a play was supposed to take place in a grand palace, expect columns, chandeliers, and a massive throne that could comfortably fit 3 of your average-sized Victorian family members and possibly a goat. For plays that involved dangerous mountains, you could bet that there would be a craggy cliffside, maybe even a painted backdrop that moved every 5 minutes to give the illusion of danger. And the best part, these plays didn't end in neat little bows. No, Victorian theater was all about leaving you emotionally wrecked at the end. Whether it was a tragic death, a shocking betrayal, or a love affair ruined by a misunderstanding, you'd leave the theater feeling like you'd just gone through a personal crisis, minus the actual trauma. You'd stand up, adjust your aching back, and wonder how the actors managed to survive the evening, much less go through it every night. Your only consolation was that tomorrow's production might just have an even bigger explosion or a more dramatic death to watch. So if you ever feel like your life is lacking a bit of excitement, just remember, the Victorians knew how to do drama. They didn't need special effects or fancy choreography. They just needed the actors to overact and the audience to willingly suffer through it all. And in the end, they all went home feeling like they'd survived a performance that had nearly killed them and loved every minute of it. Before Netflix brought the drama, Victorians had something a bit more final. Public executions were a major form of entertainment. If you were lucky, you'd get a front row seat for hanging. That's right, no cozy seat cushions or popcorn, just a front row view of someone being put to death. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of a reality show, except instead of who's getting voted off the island, it was who's going to be executed this week. Charming. Now let's set the scene. It's a crisp morning in Victorian England. You're out and about, probably not expecting to witness something so dramatic. But then you hear the unmistakable sound of a crowd gathering. People are whispering excitedly, scurrying to grab their places, and there it is, the gallows. A towering structure made from old wood, to looming over the crowd like a dark symbol of justice, or perhaps just another opportunity to watch someone's life be taken away for the sheer thrill of it. These executions weren't quiet, somber affairs. No, they were events. People turned out in droves, as though they were heading to a festival or a big match. And the best part, they weren't just spectators. They were part of the spectacle. Imagine this. The tension is palpable as the criminal is led to the scaffold. The crowd murmurs, some folks pushing to get a better view, while others gossip about how much of a scandal this particular execution is. The criminal might be a thief or someone accused of murder, and while it seems tragic in theory, the whole thing has somehow morphed into a macabre kind of entertainment. This wasn't just about justice. It was about the performance of justice. The condemned person would often be dressed in their best clothes because nothing says this is the end like a crisp, clean outfit, and would have to face the crowd, some of whom were cheering. You'd have to give the crowd credit, though. They certainly got emotionally involved. There were rumors that some people brought their children along as if it were an afternoon outing, explaining the complexities of punishment and morality to them while simultaneously nibbling on snacks. It wasn't just about the hanging itself. Oh no, the Victorian execution was a multi-act show. Before the big moment, there would be a procession. Think of it like the pre-show to the main event. The condemned person, often shackled and grim, would be led through the streets, sometimes with the crowd jeering, shouting insults, or making bets on how long the whole ordeal would take. The criminal was the main character in this macabre soap opera, and the crowd eagerly awaited the finale. As you stood in the crowd, hopefully not too close, because the splash zone was real, you'd hear the cries, see the emotional reactions, and perhaps even witness the occasional last-minute plea for mercy. But there was no mercy on offer. Not today, not here. This was pure, unfiltered, and unvarnished spectacle, and people loved it. What made it even more intriguing was how the criminals themselves were often turned into characters in their own right. Some would try to plead their innocence with their last words. Others would offer brave speeches, defiant to the end, while some might faint or break down, revealing their humanity, or perhaps their fear. When the whole thing was a giant display of emotions, from the spectacle of the execution to the drama of the criminal's final moments. If you were lucky enough to be part of the audience, it wasn't just about what happened to the person being executed. It was about the drama of it all. You were witnessing a human being, once a part of society, now being stripped of everything, every tie to their life, and publicly humiliated in front of a massive crowd. The whole thing was an emotionally charged show, filled with tension, drama, and often a sense of justified bloodlust. Then, of course, there was the aftermath. Once the criminal was hung, or in some cases, dismembered for extra horror value, people would rush to see the body, sometimes for a quick memento, or simply to gawk at the aftermath. Body parts might even be sold as grisly souvenirs to the public. Want a piece of history? Well, you could buy a little part of the criminal's end for a few pennies, because what better way to commemorate a public execution than with a genuine slice of the spectacle? If anything, it was a proof that for the Victorians, the macabre had a strange appeal, just like the most outrageous reality TV shows today. And much like today's viral content, these public executions weren't just about the spectacle for the present. They were also about creating a shared social experience. People didn't just watch the execution, they talked about it. It became part of the public discourse, something that everyone would discuss over dinner or at the local pub. This was reality television, Victorian style, minus the cameras, the editing, and the possibility of a redemption arc. The most chilling part? The fact that no one was really questioning the morality of turning someone's final moments into a public event. It was just accepted as part of life. It was the ultimate expression of societal justice, wrapped in a bloody bow and handed out to the public with a side of sensationalism. So next time you're binge watching the latest reality show and thinking about how drama-filled your life has become, just remember, the Victorians did it first, and they did it with an extra dash of public humiliation and finality. Because, hey, nothing says entertainment quite like a public execution. The Victorians loved their sports, but let's be honest, some of them were a bit strange. For instance, croquet wasn't just a game. It was an intense sport where lawnmowers were your rivals and your mallet might be your only friend. And then there was archery, a truly gentlemanly sport that involved shooting arrows at targets, preferably while wearing tight trousers. Of course, the trousers were less about comfort and more about looking dashing while you missed the target completely. Now, let's dive into this gentlemanly world of Victorian sports, where elegance and physical exertion were often paired in the most impractical of ways. Take croquet, for example. At first glance, it might look like a charming, relaxing garden game that you'd play on a sunny afternoon with a nice glass of lemonade, but in reality, Victorian croquet was a battleground. The mallet wasn't just a casual tool for knocking balls through hoops, it was a weapon to be wielded with strategic precision, and occasionally as an outlet for all your pent-up frustrations about how much your neighbor's garden looked better than yours. The rules? There were none, or at least none that anyone agreed on. It was a game filled with intense rivalry, with players casually knocking each other's balls out of the way as they made their way to victory. But if you were ever caught off guard by an aggressive opponent's swing, well, you could always count on the very polite social norms of the time to keep things just barely civil. Then there's archery, which had a certain dignified charm about it. To the Victorians, archery was the quintessential gentlemanly sport, a chance to demonstrate your refined masculinity while hurling sharp projectiles at distant targets. Picture a group of men dressed in the finest waistcoats and tight trousers, gripping their bows with all the elegance of someone who had just finished a brisk game of chess. The goal? To hit the bullseye, of course. But let's be real. Most of the time, the only thing they were hitting was their own pride. This wasn't a sport of casual enjoyment. This was a display of how dashing one could look while missing a target the size of a dinner plate from a mere 20 paces. The trousers, often tight enough to make any normal person question their ability to breathe, were there to accentuate the physical effort required to shoot. Never mind that the only thing being exerted was their willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of looking like an aristocratic hero in a costume drama. The bow was merely an accessory to the real objective, the appearance of effortless skill. If you were feeling a little more adventurous, there was always polo. Now this was a sport for those truly eager to prove their prowess in front of an audience, because what could be more impressive than galloping around on horseback, trying to hit a ball with a mallet while making sure your top hat stayed firmly in place? Polo was essentially a test of both your athleticism and your ability to maintain your dignity. It wasn't just a game, it was an opportunity to showcase your social standing. Imagine a bunch of men charging across a field, their mallets swinging with enough force to send the ball flying into oblivion, while their horses galloped with all the energy of a pack of wild animals. And all the while, the players were focused on their elegance and appearance as much as they were on the ball, because, in the world of Victorian polo, missing the target was just as important as hitting it, as long as you looked good doing it. Of course, let's not forget cricket, a sport that truly defies the modern mind. Victorian cricket wasn't just a leisurely weekend activity, it was an all-day affair that could stretch on for hours. But don't let the idyllic image of a cricket match in the park fool you. This was serious business. The cricket pitch wasn't just a place for casual conversation. It was where friendships were tested, alliances were formed, and reputations could be made or broken with a single swing of the bat. The players? They dressed to impress, as always, because nothing says athlete like a three-piece suit and a top hat. The real action in these games came not from the quality of the play, but from the drama that unfolded as players argued over every small detail. Was that a legitimate catch? Did the ball bounce before it hit the stumps? These were the kind of questions that would incite raging debates, followed by the very gentlemanly act of shaking hands and pretending like nothing had happened. Even with all the intensity of these games, the Victorians always kept things a bit polite. Sportsmanship, in their eyes, was as important as the sport itself. So even if you lost, or if you were caught cheating by moving the ball with your foot during croquet, which definitely happened, you could always count on a gentlemanly handshake at the end of it all. Because looking good was half the battle, and even if your swing missed the mark or your ball went astray, you could still count on the social graces to save face. In the end, Victorian sports weren't just about athleticism. They were a stage for displaying elegance, whether you were wielding a mallet, shooting arrows, or trying to look dashing while avoiding an embarrassing miss. And the best part? If you played badly, at least you'd look good doing it. tight trousers and all. In the Victorian era, there was a thing called a photography party. Sounds like fun, right? Except it wasn't about just getting together and snapping a selfie. Oh no, it was about gathering a whole bunch of people in a dark room and forcing them to sit still long enough for someone to take a very long exposure photograph. It's like today's TikTok challenges, but instead of lip syncing to a song, you're standing perfectly still for 20 minutes while the photographer tries to capture you looking not like you've been caught in a windstorm. Let's be real, this was not the kind of party where you'd show up, strike a pose, and then head straight to the buffet table. No, no. The photography party was a test of endurance more than a social event. First, you had to gather your friends, family, and probably a couple of people you barely knew, because nothing says good time like being crammed into a dark room with a bunch of people who aren't allowed to move. There were no filters, no quick snaps, and definitely no, hey, let's do a quick boomerang. Here, you weren't even allowed to blink. The photographer would set up the camera, which was an elaborate contraption about the size of a small wardrobe, and everyone would stand as still as humanly possible. Now, the idea of a long exposure photograph sounds straightforward. Just keep still and wait for the picture to be taken. But here's the kicker. These exposures could last up to 20 minutes, a small eternity in a room full of people desperately trying to hold their positions like they're auditioning for a role as a statue in a park. Can you imagine a whole bunch of people standing rigidly, trying their best to look relaxed while absolutely not moving in any way? If you shifted slightly, you risked ruining the entire shot. That slight twitch, gone. A cough? That's it. Start over. You might as well have been asked to hold a yoga pose on a bed of nails. The fashion of the time didn't exactly make things easier either. If you were a Victorian woman, you were probably wrapped in enough layers of clothing to resemble a walking cake. Corsets, petticoats, bustles, and more layers than any reasonable human should wear for the sake of looking dignified. Men weren't much better off, with their stiff collars, waistcoat, and long coats, making it nearly impossible to be comfortable while standing still for long periods. And don't even get me started on the hats. Oh, the hats. They were so large and elaborate. They probably created their own gravitational pull. The bigger the hat, the more important you appeared. But try holding a serious expression while balancing a top hat that looks like it could shelter a small village. The whole experience was more about survival than artistry. But what did these unfortunate souls do for all those minutes while they stood frozen like mannequins? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There was no checking your phone because, well, that wasn't invented yet. No chatting with friends, and certainly no passing time by making funny faces to entertain yourself. You just had to stand there. Think about the effort that would take. Every muscle in your body screaming for release, and yet you had to remain still, looking calm, collected, and above all, poised for posterity. Your facial expression had to be perfect, but not too perfect, because heaven forbid, you accidentally looked too stiff. It's like that moment when you smile for a photo today and instantly question whether you're smiling too much, too little, or just weirdly. The absurdity doesn't end with the posing. There was the photographer standing behind a giant contraption, which was essentially a box with a lens and a complicated setup that involved chemicals and a whole lot of patience. Instead of the quick, easy snap of a modern camera, the photographer would be manually adjusting, carefully timing the exposure, and waiting for the right moment to finally capture the image. The result? A photograph where everyone looks, well, like they're trying to outlast an awkward moment rather than look happy. You didn't just pose, you suffered for that picture. You were a part of the artistic process, which mostly involved being utterly still and pretending to be fine with it. And here's the real kicker. Once the photo was taken, you couldn't just share it on Instagram for a quick instant validation. No. Those photographs were expensive and time-consuming to develop, so you'd be left to wait weeks, possibly months, for your image to finally be produced. By the time you got it back, you might have completely forgotten how uncomfortable you were during the whole process. But when did you finally get to see it? There you were, frozen in time, looking as stiff as the 19th century furniture in the background. Still, these photography parties were the height of social interaction in Victorian times, a bizarre intersection of art, vanity, and sheer human determination. And while it's hard to imagine voluntarily enduring that much stillness for the sake of a photo, it's easy to see how, in their own way, these parties were the forerunners to our modern-day social media challenges. After all, what are today's viral trends but a new way to perform for an audience? Back in the day, though, they didn't need hashtags. They just needed to get through 20 minutes of absolute, utter stillness while trying to keep their eyes from twitching. Now that's commitment. Let's fast forward to the late 1800s, when moving pictures first made their appearance. Sure, you've got fancy CGI and IMAX theaters now, but back then, a film might only last 30 seconds and involve a guy on a bicycle riding past a church. But to the Victorians, this was a revolution. They didn't know it, but they were at the beginning of something that would lead to big-budget blockbusters and a whole lot of awkward acting. It wasn't much, but it was a start, just like a kid learning to walk, but tripping over every single toy on the floor. Imagine this. It's the end of the 19th century, and the world is buzzing with excitement. People are staring wide-eyed at these newfangled inventions called motion pictures, where images, once thought to be static, now move in front of their eyes. Picture this. A blurry, black and white film shows a man riding a bicycle past a church. He doesn't stop, there's no plot twist, and frankly, it doesn't even make sense why anyone would want to watch it. But there they are, crowds of curious Victorians, watching in awe as a series of still images flicker by at such a speed that it almost seems like magic. It wasn't quite the cinematic masterpieces we know today, but to the people of the Victorian era, it was like discovering fire, or at least a slightly less dangerous version of it. But here's the thing. Early cinema was a far cry from today's smooth, glossy productions. The acting? Well, let's just say it was stiff, very stiff. These were not trained professionals. They were just people doing the best they could with an entirely new medium that required an entirely new form of expression. Imagine trying to act while not knowing if your performance would even be visible once the film was developed. You had to project as if the entire audience was sitting across a football field from you. And so actors exaggerated every movement, and I mean exaggerated. A simple glance became a dramatic, borderline terrifying stare that looked like they were trying to summon a spell. A walk down the street? More like a series of awkward, overemphasized leg swings that would make a modern actor break out in a sweat. And let's not even talk about the emotions. These early performers weren't subtle. If a character was sad, you knew it. They didn't just frown, they threw their entire body into it. The Victorians weren't shy about their feelings, especially when it came to making their feelings clear on screen, even if it meant looking completely ridiculous. The plots? You can forget about intricate storylines or character development. One of the earliest films ever made was a 30-second clip of a train pulling into a station. The audience watched it, gasped, and then immediately wondered if they'd just witnessed the world's first ghost train. But that was the charm of it, the simplicity. People were so amazed by the fact that images could move that they didn't care if the plot made any sense. The whole thing was a spectacle, a feat of technology, and the crowd was willing to forgive the lack of storytelling in exchange for the sheer wonder of it all. But as we know, the Victorians weren't exactly shy about pushing boundaries. They may have started with simple bicycle rides and train arrivals, but that was just the beginning. Eventually, films began to grow in length as people figured out how to handle the technical side of things. A few minutes of footage turned into 15 minutes, and before long, filmmakers were testing out different types of shots, angles, and even using different backdrops. This led to some very creative decisions in terms of setting and special effects. Imagine a scene where a person suddenly disappears and the camera cuts to an entirely different setting, all within a few seconds. It wasn't the smoothest transition, and it definitely wasn't realistic, but in those early days, it was mind-blowing. What's most striking about these early films is how primitive they were. You could hear the gears turning on the film projector as it chugged through the reel, sometimes struggling to keep the images in sync with the motion. The frames were jerky, the lighting was poor, and the sound? Well, there wasn't any. So the audience would just sit in silence, occasionally laughing or gasping at the oddities on screen, but mostly staring in wonder as people on screen moved, because let's be real, the real magic was the idea that these static, two-dimensional images could somehow come to life. To Victorians, it felt like they were watching the future unfold before their eyes. And as these early films became more popular, the industry began to grow, albeit slowly. What started in tiny, cramped rooms, filled with curious onlookers and makeshift cameras, soon began to expand. Theaters popped up, and people started to pay to sit in these dark rooms and watch the magic of early cinema on a big screen. The performances might have been over the top and the plots nonsensical, but people didn't care. This was a new frontier in entertainment, and for the first time, people could sit back, relax, and watch a moving picture, and it was unlike anything they had ever seen before. So while today's movies are full of spectacular CGI, complex plots, and highly trained actors, the Victorians were just getting started. Early cinema may have had more awkward acting than award-winning performances, but it laid the foundation for the entertainment we enjoy today. Back then, it wasn't about perfection, it was about discovery. The world had stumbled upon something extraordinary, and no one knew quite what it would become. But one thing was for sure, the Victorians were witnessing the birth of a new form of storytelling, one that would evolve from clunky bicycles into the action-packed blockbusters we know and love today. As you drift off tonight, think about the Victorians, those wide-eyed dreamers witnessing the first flickers of moving images. They didn't have CGI, massive budgets, or even smooth camera transitions. They had raw, choppy footage of a man on a bicycle, and yet they were witnessing the future unfold right before their eyes. From their awkward poses in front of giant cameras to the invention of something that would eventually change the world, the Victorians were part of a revolution. Sure, it was messy, and it wasn't always graceful, but they paved the way for something far bigger than they could have ever imagined, something we now take for granted in the form of blockbusters and endless streaming content. So as you cozy up in your modern world with your screens, perfectly curated social media, and seamless storytelling, so remember how those first flickering frames had the power to captivate, confuse, and amaze. The journey from those awkward, jerky films to the masterpieces we enjoy today is a testament to how far we've come. Yet there's something magical about the way the Victorians saw the world, through the lens of possibility, even when it was a little bit blurry. So tonight, as you lay back and drift into sleep, perhaps consider the wonder that exists in the small things, the first steps in an era that would eventually transform entertainment. And who knows, maybe in your dreams, you'll catch a glimpse of the magic that started with a few simple frames and all of the excitement they created. Okay, good night.